All right, everybody, welcome to our first lesson here in our unit on the Cold War. So today we're going to talk about the Cold War starts. So here's our objectives and standards: to recognize the leading factors of the Cold War and summarize early conflicts between the US and the Soviet Union. If you would, please take a look at the standards. We have a couple of vocab words here. United Nations, an international organization established after World War II of countries intended to prevent aggression by members. The Iron Curtain, a term used to represent division between democratic Western Europe and communist Eastern Europe. Containment, a policy to stop the spread and influence by the Soviet Union around the globe. Truman Doctrine, used to support countries in their struggle against communist influence, especially in Turkey and Greece. The Marshall Plan, a plan of aid by the U.S. to supply food, machinery, and other materials to rebuild Western Europe. And our desired result was, what were the conflicts in the beginning of the Cold War? Okay, so before the end of World War II, the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union began to decline. The US was angry that the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939, and Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was also angry that the Allies did not invade German-occupied Europe before 1944. So there's a lot of tension there even during World War II. And both sides began to pursue very different goals. So in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, you see them down there, met in the Soviet Union in Yalta. They agreed that at the conclusion of the war, they would divide Germany into occupation zones controlled by the Allies. Now, Germany would also have to compensate the Soviet Union for the loss of life and property. And Stalin, in return for this, basically agrees to enter the war in the Pacific, and that Eastern Europeans would have free elections. In June 1945, the United Nations was formed. The US and the Soviet Union put aside their differences and joined with 48 other nations in the organization, which is still around to this day. It consists of a General Assembly of all member nations. There was also a Security Council, still to this day, that made up of 11 members who would investigate and settle disputes. The Security Council has 5 permanent members, kind of the victors of World War II, kind of. Great Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and France. And this is still true to this day. The other 6 members are rotated. I'm not sure if it's on a yearly basis, or I'm not sure the time frame is, but these 5 countries always stay on the Security Council, and then the other countries are kind of rotated in and out for a fair share. Each permanent member could veto or prevent any Security Council action. So if Great Britain, disagrees with what the other countries in the Security Council want to do, they can veto that action. That's to prevent countries from forming an alliance to create, a war again. Now, despite their agreements at Yalta and in regards to the United Nations, the US and the Soviet Union had very different views. The US and the Soviet Union had different outcomes in terms of lives lost and destruction because of World War II. The Soviet Union lost, many more lives than the United States, and their country was pretty much ravaged by the war. Not to say the U.S. wasn't hit hard, but we really didn't have the same effects that the Soviet Union and the Soviets had. They also had different political and economic goals. Now, a major goal of the Soviets was to stop another invasion from the West. Okay, so they don't want any more countries invading them. So to do this, the countries that Stalin occupied in Eastern Europe towards the end of the war became a buffer or protection zone from another invasion. So he takes these countries and he installs or secures communist governments in Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Romania to kind of create this kind of barrier between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. That way nobody could invade him again. President Truman was also angry that Stalin would not allow free elections in Eastern Europe, so even though Stalin had promised free elections, he doesn't allow it to happen. So he had refused the idea of free elections at Potsdam in July 1945. In early 1946, Stalin makes a statement stating that capitalism and communism cannot exist in the same world together. Okay, so that's a pretty strong statement. So while Europe became divided, Germany was also split among the Allies. Now the Soviet Union controlled the East, including half of Berlin, which became known as the German Democratic Republic, and the western parts of Germany. I'm sorry, that should say Germany, not German. Let me fix it. I'll put a Y here. Germany. If I can fit my pen in here. That's not gonna work. Let me do this. Sorry guys, let me just fix this real quick for you. Germany. It's really hard to write with this thing. Probably all getting a good laugh watching this right now. Oh my gosh, the horrible Y. Alright, close enough. Sorry. The western parts of Germany became known as the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. Winston Churchill gave a speech. We're trying to fix this Y again, but I will leave them. Winston Churchill gave a speech and described the division in Europe between democratic Western Europe and communist Eastern Europe. And he called the division an Iron Curtain. Just trying to fix this real quick because I really didn't like that. I know this is pretty big, but a little bit better. There we go. All right. Hopefully that's a little bit better. So here we have a map of the Cold War of how kind of Europe was divided between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. The red would be the kind of communist Soviet countries there, and then the blue countries would be more of the democratic kind of free countries there. And this white line here, which I'm trying to outline here in black for you, would be where the Iron Curtain is, where Winston Churchill is talking about the Iron Curtain where it divides Europe. So not, again, really not a real wall necessarily, but or a curtain, but kind of like an invisible line that divides Europe. The U.S. attempted to offset the threat of the Soviet Union in the late 1940s. President Truman adopted a policy of containment by forming alliances and supporting weaker countries against the Soviets. So he's trying to keep communism contained to the Soviet Union or those countries already. He doesn't want it spreading anymore. In the Truman Doctrine, President Truman contrasted democracy with communism. It also called for the United States to support countries that were struggling against communist influence, such as Turkey and Greece. And $400 million in aid was provided by the U.S. Congress to aid to those countries. So to stop communist, revolutions from starting those countries, to help these countries fight back against the spread of communism in their own kind of nations. And after World War II, much of Europe was in ruins, and there were very little food and jobs. We talked about that. U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed giving aid to European countries in need. The Marshall Plan provided aid to help rebuild Western Europe. And Yugoslavia also received assistance after it broke away from Soviet control. So again, the idea is to help these countries rebuild, but it's also to stop, these countries from falling or into, the plans of the communists to support them and to keep these countries strong against any type of communist uprising or things like that. So while Europe began to rebuild, the U.S. and its allies clashed with the Soviet Union in regards to Germany. The Soviets wanted Germany weak and divided, but France, the U.S., and Great Britain united their occupation zones and withdrew their forces. So instead of having these 4 division zones, we now have 2. We have the Soviets controlling one, we have the Allies controlling another. The Soviet Union was angry at this, and they decided to hold West Berlin hostage. So the Soviets cut off highway, rail traffic, and water into the western zones of Berlin. And as the city began to starve, Stalin believed that the Allies would surrender West Berlin or just kind of give up. Instead, what the American and British officials did was they had an airdrop of supplies to food and supplies to the citizens of West Berlin for 11 months. This becomes known as the Berlin Airlift. And finally, after about a year or so, a little over a year, in May 1949, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade. So these conflicts start the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union began using spying, propaganda, secret operations, and diplomacy to some degree when dealing with each other beginning in 1949. Now, after the Berlin blockade, 10 Western European nations joined with the United States and Canada to form a defensive military alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. This is still around today. The Soviet Union saw NATO as a threat and formed its own alliance in 1955 called the Warsaw Pact. Okay, in 1961, the Berlin Wall was built by the Soviets to separate East and West Berlin and came to symbolize division around the world. Now, just one thing to note, and we'll talk about this later on too when we talk about the Cold War, is that not every country joined the U.S. or the Soviet Union, picked a side necessarily for these alliances, but we'll talk about that much later. Now, the U.S. had already dropped atomic bombs on Japan, we know that, but in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its own atomic weapon. President Truman was determined to develop an even deadlier weapon before the Soviets. So he authorized work to develop a thermonuclear weapon in 1950. The hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb, would be thousands of times more powerful than the atomic bomb. And the US tested their hydrogen bomb in 1952, but shortly after that, the Soviets developed their own in 1953. Now, President Eisenhower, maybe you'll remember General Eisenhower's name. He was a general during World War II. He becomes President of the United States in 1953. Now, John Foster Dulles was his Secretary of State, and he is a strong anti-communist. Dulles threatened to attack if the Soviet Union or its allies threatened the U.S., and this policy becomes known as brinkmanship, of saying, hey, you know what, if you want to threaten us or, try and do anything to us or our allies, we'll launch an attack right back. So this is known as brinkmanship, of, being willing to just go to war at any moment. Now, it did require a good source of nuclear weapons and airplanes. The U.S. increased its air force strength and stockpiled nuclear weapons, and in response to this, the Soviet Union did the same. So the Cold War affected science and education for both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. In August 1957, Soviets developed a rocket that can travel far distances, known as an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. And they used it to push Sputnik, the first unmanned satellite, above the atmosphere. Americans were fearful that this satellite could spy on them, could drop weapons, but more so, they were just upset that we had kind of fallen behind the Soviets in terms of science. But about a year later, in 1958, the U.S. launched its first satellite as well. Now, one thing to kind of calm tension and form some type of peace, President Eisenhower had suggested the U.S. and the Soviet Union be able to fly over each other to protect against a nuclear attack. Now, when the Soviet Union said no to this, high-altitude spy flights began over the USSR by U-2 planes. And this was done by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. Again, you've probably heard of them before, too. So tensions were super high after the Soviet Union shot down a U-2 plane that was used for spying, and pilot Gary Francis Powers was captured in May 1960. The pilot, Gary Powers, will be released eventually in a prisoner exchange, but this was a very tense moment between the United States and the Soviet Union, and this is going to show you how tense things are going to become between these countries following post-World War II. Many different issues and many different conflicts are going to arise between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that spread around the world. In our closure, what were the conflicts at the beginning of the Cold War? Think about the Iron Curtain, think about some of the problems in Germany with the Berlin Airlift and things like that, and that will help you answer your question here. Alright, so have a great rest of your day or night, and I will talk to you all soon.